There is a soup on this list that a grandmother in northern Saskatchewan made every single day for 4 months straight in 1934. Not because she liked it, because it was the only thing standing between her family and an empty table in a farmhouse where the temperature inside dropped to -15 overnight. She never wrote the recipe down. She never had to. Her hands knew it the way your hands know how to tie your shoes. That knowledge is almost gone now. And this list exists because it deserves to be remembered. Hi, my name is Jeff, and this is Forgotten Canadian Foods. We find the meals that built this country, the ones that disappeared not because they failed, but because prosperity taught us to forget them. Number 25, water soup with bread and drippings. We are starting here because this is the bottom of the list, and also, in the worst years, the bottom of the pantry. Water soup was exactly what it sounds like. Boiling water. A scrape of whatever fat was left in the dripping tin, salt, and a heel of bread torn into the bowl. That was the meal. Prairie homestead diaries from the 1930s document this without drama, the way you write down the weather. Had water soup for dinner, children did not complain. If you are reading that and thinking it barely qualifies as soup, you are right. It barely qualified as supper. But it was hot, and it was something, and on a January night when the wind was coming through the walls of a tar paper shack outside Moose Jaw, hot and something was enough to matter. The drippings came from whatever meat had been cooked that week, collected in a tin kept at the back of the stove. Nothing was thrown away. The fat was the flavor, and the flavor was survival. Number 24, oatmeal broth. This one surprises people every time. Coarse rolled oats, the kind that took 40 minutes on the wood stove, were simmered in salted water with an onion and sometimes a marrow bone if the week had been kind. The oats dissolved partway, thickening the broth into something that sat at the border between soup and porridge without committing to either. It was eaten from a bowl at midday on the prairies when the noon meal had to be fast, and the morning's work had burned through breakfast entirely. Oral histories from homesteading communities east of Regina describe oatmeal broth as the soup that no one ever asked for and everyone was relieved to see. You did not love it. You ate it and went back to work. A 5-pound bag of oats cost about 20 cents in 1920 and fed a family through a week of this. Economy does not get more honest than that. Number 23rd, turnip and water soup. The turnip was the most reliable vegetable in the prairie root cellar. It kept through any cold, resisted rot better than the potato, and grew in soil that barely tolerated anything else. Sliced thin and simmered in salted water with a single onion and whatever herb had survived the drying rack, turnip soup was the meal that appeared when the potato supply needed to be stretched, and the meat supply had already been stretched past recognition. Some grandmothers added a spoon of lard to round the sharpness of the turnip. Some added a pinch of dry mustard, which is either an act of genius or an act of desperation depending on your perspective. Probably both. The turnip gave the broth a sweetness that was genuinely pleasant when the body was cold and the stomach was empty, which was most of the time from November to April on a homestead that had a bad harvest behind it. Number 22, barley and saltwater soup. Barley was one of the cheapest things in any general store from Winnipeg to Prince Albert. A pound cost 8 cents in 1912, and it swelled in water to 3 or 4 times its dry volume, which is the kind of arithmetic that kept children fed when arithmetic was the only tool a mother had. A cup of barley, salted water, an onion, and thyme. That was the soup. It thickened as it cooked into something dense and filling that stuck to the ribs in the way that thin broth never could. Women who made this through the Depression described the trick of adding the barley early and letting it cook until it nearly dissolved, making the soup cloudy and thick enough to qualify as a meal rather than an apology for one. A pot fed 6 people for under a dime. Logging camps north of Sudbury served barley soup 3 times a week, and the men never complained. which, for a bunkhouse full of lumberjacks operating on 4 hours of sleep, is something close to a miracle. Number 21st, dried pea soup without the ham bone. Everyone knows pea soup with the ham bone. This is the version without it, because in the leanest years, the ham bone was a luxury that had already been used twice. Yellow split peas, soaked overnight, simmered in water with onion, salt, and, if the pantry allowed it, a scrape of lard. No pork, no smokiness. Just the PEA, which is sweeter than people give it credit for when it has been left alone to do its work for 3 hours in a covered pot. This soup appeared in relief records from the dirty 30s across rural Saskatchewan and Alberta. Federal agencies distributing flour and dried goods to families on the edge noted that dried peas were the single item that produced the most meals per pound of anything in the relief package. The women who received them already knew that. They had been making this soup long before anyone from the government thought to document it. Number 20, potato and onion soup. Here is where the root cellar becomes a kitchen. 2 ingredients that grew in every prairie garden and kept through any Saskatchewan winter without a jar or a lid. Potatoes diced rough, onions sliced thin, salted water, a lid on the pot, and an hour on the back of the stove. Some grandmothers mashed half the potatoes against the side of the pot to thicken the broth. Some left them whole. Some added a knob of lard at the end and stirred it in until the surface shimmered. The best versions had dried dill from the rafters and a splash of whatever cream remained from the morning milking. The plainest versions had none of that and were eaten without comment and without waste. Oral histories from Ukrainian settlements east of Saskatoon describe potato and onion soup as the meal that showed up every Monday of every winter without fail. The soup so constant it stopped being noticed, the way wallpaper stops being noticed until the day it was not there. Number 19, cabbage and water soup. A head of cabbage cost almost nothing and lasted weeks in the cold cellar without any processing at all. Shredded coarse and dropped into salted water with an onion and a bay leaf, it produced a broth that was thin but genuinely flavored. Sweet from the cabbage, faintly bitter at the edge, it warmed you in the specific way that only a hot bowl of something can, when the cold is coming from inside the house as much as outside it. German, Ukrainian, and Polish settlers brought cabbage soup traditions with them and adapted them immediately to what the prairie had to offer. In February, that was usually cabbage and onion, and the patience to sit beside a stove for an hour without expecting much in return. Some versions added a spoonful of vinegar at the end. Some added caraway seeds. Some added nothing, because nothing was what was available. And the cabbage was honest enough to make a decent soup without any help. Number 18, dandelion green soup. First pattern break. Every prairie spring began with the same calculation. The root cellar was nearly empty. The garden was not yet planted. The last jar of preserves had been opened in March. And then, in late April, the dandelions came up in the yard, along the ditches, and in every crack of the kitchen garden where nothing useful had yet appeared. Women who knew what they were doing, which was most of them, picked the young leaves before the flowers opened and dropped them into a broth made from whatever bones remained, or into salted water when the bones were gone. The soup was bitter and green, and it tasted like the season changing. After a prairie winter with no fresh vegetable from October to May, bitter and green tasted like the best thing in the world. Medical records from homesteading communities document that the spring appearance of wild greens corresponded with the disappearance of symptoms their doctors carefully attributed to vitamin deficiency. The grandmothers did not know the word for what they were correcting. They just knew to go outside and pick the yard. Number 17, bone broth with nothing else. Not a base. Not an ingredient in something larger. the soup itself. A beef knuckle, a pork spine, a chicken carcass. Whatever the week's cooking had produced was dropped into the pot with water, salt, an onion, and left to simmer for 8 hours on the back of the wood stove, while the family went about the work of staying alive in a cold climate. By evening, the broth was dark and glossy, rich with gelatin that made your lips stick together, deep with a savory quality that no powder or cube has ever come close to matching. Ladled into bowls with a heel of bread, this was supper, not a starter. Prairie Homestead Diaries from the 1920s record bone broth on the table. 4 and 5 nights running during the weeks when the meat supply was down to whatever the bones could still offer. The bones were used until they crumbled. This is not a metaphor. Number 16, whey soup. This one is so forgotten that most Canadians under the age of 60 have never heard of it. That is a shame because it is one of the most resourceful entries on this list. When butter was churned, the buttermilk remained. When cheese was made, the whey remained. Prairie women, particularly in Mennonite and German settlements across Manitoba and Saskatchewan, took that liquid, which most modern kitchens would pour down the drain without a second thought, and made soup from it. Simmered with potatoes, seasoned with salt and dill, and thickened slightly with flour, whey soup was mild, faintly sour, and deeply nourishing in the specific way fermented dairy products are nourishing. People have understood that for centuries, and clinical nutrition is only now getting around to confirming it. A Mennonite grandmother in Steinbach did not need a study. She needed the whey and a pot. Number 15. Sorrel soup. Wild sorrel grew in every river valley and creek bottom from Manitoba to the foothills. It looked like spinach and tasted like a lemon had an argument with a leaf and lost. Prairie women who knew their wild plants, and most of them knew far more than any modern forager with a smartphone app, gathered sorrel in spring and early summer and made a soup that was genuinely tart, genuinely green, and genuinely free. Simmered in water or broth with a potato for body, and a spoon of cream if the cow was still producing, sorrel soup was a seasonal event. A 2-week window in late spring when the land offered something sharp and alive and unlike anything that had come out of a jar since August. Ukrainian and Polish settlements east of Edmonton describe sorrel soup as the first real meal of spring, the one that proved the ground was waking up again. That might sound like poetry. After a northern prairie winter, it was just accurate. Number 14. Bean and tomato soup. Second pattern break. By the 1950s, canned tomatoes had arrived in every prairie pantry and changed the arithmetic of winter soup entirely. A tin cost about 12 cents. Combined with a cup of dried navy beans soaked overnight and simmered with onion, salt, and a pinch of dried basil from the garden rack, canned tomatoes produced a soup that was bright and filling in a way that pure water-based soups could not match. The tomato gave the bean broth a color and a sharpness that made the bowl look and taste like something that had been cooked on purpose rather than assembled from necessity. And that was the important psychological distinction on a February evening in a small Saskatchewan farmhouse where the temperature outside was minus 35 and the week still had 2 days left in it. Children ate this soup without argument. That was the highest recommendation any meal could receive. Number 13, nettle soup. Stinging nettles grew wild across every province and territory in Canada. They grew along fence lines, in creek bottoms, in the shade of every barn and outbuilding from Newfoundland to British Columbia. They stung when you touched them raw, and they stopped stinging the moment they hit boiling water. Prairie women and First Nations grandmothers both knew what to do with nettles and had known for far longer than any European settlement had existed on this land. Gathered young in spring with cloth-covered hands, dropped into salted water with a potato and an onion, simmered 20 minutes until the leaves turned deep green and soft. Nettle soup was both free and genuinely nutritious in a way that made it one of the more defensible meals on this list from a modern nutritional standpoint. It tasted green and slightly mineral, like a good spinach, but more serious, more insistent. The kind of flavor that announces it has been here longer than you have. Number 12, oxtail soup. Oxtail cost almost nothing at any butcher in Canada from the 1880s through the 1950s because it required hours of work to produce a result, and most town families did not have hours to spare on a weeknight. Farm women did, or rather they had the wood stove, which did the work for them. A whole oxtail dropped into a pot with onions, carrots, a turnip, salt, peppercorns, and enough water to cover, simmered for 8 to 10 hours while the household went about its business. By evening, the broth was so rich it set to a firm jelly overnight. The meat pulled from the bone in dark, soft shreds. The fat had rendered into the broth and enriched everything. Served with bread, it was supper. Strained and served alone, it was medicine, the kind your grandmother prescribed when you were sick. And modern medicine now confirms she was onto something real. Butchers in prairie towns gave oxtails away in the 1930s because nobody with money wanted them. That arrangement suited everyone who had no money perfectly. Number 11, tripe soup. I know, stay with me. Tripe, the stomach lining of beef cattle, was a regular feature of working-class Canadian tables from the 1890s through the 1950s. Particularly in Quebec, Acadian communities, and in the immigrant settlements of the prairies where wasting any part of a slaughtered animal was considered not just impractical, but genuinely offensive to the animal and to the effort it had taken to raise it. Cleaned, blanched, cut into strips, and simmered for hours in broth with onion, garlic, tomato, and herbs, tripe produced a soup that was deeply savory and gelatinous in the specific way that collagen-rich cuts always are when given it enough time and heat. Quebec grandmothers made a version with milk that was white and rich and mild. Ukrainian grandmothers made a version with vinegar and horseradish that was sharp enough to clear a head cold from 3 rooms away. Both versions were the soup you ate when nothing was wasted. That principle has not aged a single day. Number 10, smoked fish chowder. In the communities around Lake Winnipeg, Lake Manitoba, and across the fishing settlements of the Maritimes, smoked fish was the winter protein that did not require refrigeration, did not spoil, and cost almost nothing beyond the effort of catching and smoking it. Shredded into a chowder with diced potatoes, onion, a pour of milk, and a knob of butter if the month allowed it, smoked fish produced a soup that was deeply flavored and filling in the particular way that only fat and protein together can fill a person against cold weather. The smokiness moved through the whole pot, into the broth, and into every piece of potato until the entire bowl tasted of wood smoke and winter and the lake in October. Oral histories from Icelandic settlements around Gimli, Manitoba describe smoked fish chowder as the soup that appeared every Friday from November to April without discussion or variation. 50 Fridays. Same soup. Nobody complained, nobody had to. Number 9, pork hock and sauerkraut soup. Third pattern break. This is the one that crossed every ethnic line on the prairie. German, Ukrainian, Polish, Czech, and Mennonite settlers all arrived with the same understanding of what a pork hock and a crock of fermented cabbage could do together in a pot of water. The hock simmered for 4 hours until the meat loosened from the bone and the fat rendered into the broth and turned it cloudy and rich. The sauerkraut went in for the last hour, its brine mellowing in the heat, its sourness spreading through the whole pot and cutting through the fat in a way that made the broth somehow feel lighter and richer at the same time. That sounds like a contradiction. It is not. It is fermentation chemistry that prairie grandmothers figured out centuries before anyone put it in a journal. Served with dark bread and mustard, this was Saturday supper in every settlement east of Saskatoon from 1910 through 1960. The recipe is in handwritten notebooks that are sitting in the bottom drawers of farmhouses right now, waiting for someone to open them. Number 8. Habitants, pea soup with salt pork. This is the one that kept Quebec alive, not a variation. The real thing. Yellow split peas soaked overnight, a smoked ham bone, or a thick chunk of salt pork, a whole onion, water, salt, and thyme. 6 hours minimum on a wood stove that never went cold. The soup turned golden and thick, genuinely thick. The kind of thick where a spoon set in the center stands up on its own, which in Quebec was not a figure of speech, but an actual quality standard grandmothers applied before calling the family to the table. It appeared 3 times a week in French-Canadian farmhouses and logging camp cook shacks and fishing community kitchens from the Gaspé to the Ottawa Valley. A pound of dried peas cost 15 cents in 1954. A ham bone came from the joint that was already eaten. The pot fed a family for 2 days and improved with every reheating, which is the single most important quality any soup can have when the wood needs to be kept for warmth and the stove cannot be running all day. Number 7. Rubaboo soup. Here is the one food historians are still working to fully reconstruct. Rubaboo was not originally a soup. It was the survival meal of the Métis Nation and the voyageur brigades that traveled the fur trade routes of the interior. Pemmican, dried meat packed tight with rendered fat and crushed berries, was dissolved in boiling water and thickened with corn flour or dried peas until it reached a consistency somewhere between soup and stew. It delivered fat, protein, and carbohydrate in a single bowl from a single pot over an open fire in the middle of a February blizzard somewhere north of anywhere with a name. When the pemmican ran low in Métis households through the homesteading era, grandmothers adapted it. Dried venison replaced bison. Dried Saskatoon berries and wild roots were added. The same principle, the same pot. A meal that asked nothing from the landscape but gave everything back to the body that needed to work in it. Elder knowledge keepers in Métis communities across the prairies are working to recover this recipe now. What is at stake is not a soup. It is the memory of how this land was first made livable. Number 6. Corn and bean soup from dried goods. First Nations women across the prairies had been drying corn for winter use for centuries, before any homesteader arrived with a plow. Settler women who learned from their neighbors, often more learned than history books tend to credit, ate better for it through every hard winter. Dried corn, rehydrated in a long simmer, produced a sweetness and a slight smokiness that fresh corn never achieves. Combined with dried beans, soaked overnight, and with whatever bone or salt pork the week offered, corn and bean soup became a 3 sisters meal in a pot. The 3 plants that fed each other in the soil were now feeding people together in the bowl. It was thick, sustaining, and genuinely ancient. It is the oldest recipe on this list by several hundred years. We buy fresh corn year-round from California now. We have lost what it becomes when you dry it. That is a trade we made without understanding what we were trading away. Number 5. Mennonite cabbage borscht. This is not the beet borscht you get in a Ukrainian restaurant, not even close. The Mennonite grandmothers who arrived in Manitoba in the 1870s brought a version of borscht that shared almost nothing with the restaurant version except the name and the general category of hot liquid in a bowl. No beets. A ham bone simmered for hours until the broth ran deep and smoky. A whole head of cabbage, shredded and added to the pot. Potatoes. Tomatoes from the August canning, stirred in from the jar. Fresh dill, if the season allowed. At the last moment, before the bowls were set out, a generous pour of heavy cream was stirred in until the broth turned ivory and rich. Sweet from the cabbage, sour from the tomato, smoky from the pork, rich from the cream. It was made in a pot large enough to last 3 days, and it was better on day 3 than it had been on day 1. Oral histories from Mennonite settlements in Steinbach and Winkler describe the smell of this soup as the smell of community. The soup that appeared when neighbors came to raise a barn, when the community gathered after a loss, when one pot on one stove was the only answer to the specific cold that has nothing to do with weather. Number 4. Moose bone soup. In northern Ontario, northern Manitoba, and across the boreal communities of the Northwest Territories, the moose was not a trophy. The moose was the winter. Not one part of it was thrown away. The bones simmered for 12 hours, producing a broth so dark it was nearly black, so rich in marrow and gelatin that a single bowl felt like medicine and a meal at the same time. First Nations families across the boreal had been making this soup longer than the concept of a recipe has existed in the European tradition. No cookbook has captured it. No restaurant has come close. Number 3. Salt cod chowder from the Atlantic. Along the entire Atlantic coast, salt cod was not a heritage ingredient kept alive by enthusiasts. It was survival protein. The fish was soaked overnight, then flaked into a pot with salt pork rendered crisp in the bottom, onions softened in the fat, and potatoes cut thick. Milk was poured over everything. The pot was never allowed to boil, because boiling breaks a milk chowder, and every grandmother on the Atlantic coast knew that the way she knew her own children's voices. White and rich, smoky and deeply savory. A whole dried cod cost under $1 in 1952. The maritime provinces built themselves on this fish. Number 2. Depression potato soup with dumplings. This is the soup that kept families alive through the worst years of the 1930s. Not as a choice, as arithmetic. 60 pounds of potatoes in the root cellar, 4 months of winter ahead. A woman outside Swift Current in 1933 made this soup every single day. She stretched it with dumplings. Flour, salt, water, a spoon of lard dropped by the spoonful into the simmering pot. The dumplings swelled and turned something thin into something filling. There are still women in Saskatchewan who ate this soup for 90 days running. They do not describe it with shame. They describe it with facts. Number 1. PEA soup with nothing. The soup that kept Canada alive. Not the version with the ham bone, the version with nothing. Dried yellow peas, water, salt, 1 onion. That is the complete list. A pound of dried peas cost 15 cents and fed a family of 6 for 2 full days when there was nothing else in the pantry, and 4 months of winter still ahead. French-Canadian families made it. Prairie homesteaders made it. Relief kitchen volunteers in Winnipeg and Regina made it by the 100 gallons through the worst winters of the dirty 30s. This soup has no glamour and no technique. It just kept more Canadians alive than anything else on this list. 25 soups. 1 story. These were not made by chefs. They were made by women standing at wood stoves in farmhouses where the thermometer read -30 outside, and the pantry held a bag of dried peas, an onion, and not much else. They were made by logging camp cooks at 4 in the morning for 60 men who needed to be fed before the axes swung. They were made by grandmothers whose names are not in any history book, whose recipes are not in any archive, whose knowledge was passed hand to hand and bowl to bowl, and is now sitting in the memories of the oldest people in the smallest towns in the coldest corners of this country. That knowledge is leaving. Every year, it leaves a little more. Tell me in the comments what soup your grandmother made. Tell me if you still have the recipe written down somewhere. Tell me if you lost it. Because if you lost it, that matters too. The soup that kept your family alive through a Saskatchewan winter in 1935 deserves better than to disappear into the back of a drawer. This has been Forgotten Canadian Foods. I am Jeff. Hit subscribe, because next time we are going somewhere the history books really do not want to talk about. And bring a bowl.